I am very happy to be here and honored to be here with Steve, who has become a friend. Can we say that? It's fair enough?
Yeah, I'm hesitating a bit.
No, it's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. It's good to know. And that's not going to change the tenor of the questions. It's not going to make anything easier. And this book, which represents to you, at least from my mind, as something of a departure. I knew you before I became your friend as the world's foremost pogromist. Could we say this? And a man who wrote the definitive history of the phenomenon of the pogrom, which is it has a little bit less sex, or a different kind of sex than the Philip Roth book, but it's a masterpiece.
He said that, not me.
Yeah, I said that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. Everything I said.
Okay.
And as the biographer of Achad Ha'am, I though there is some gap in our ages, I don't think you experienced a pogrom, and I don't think you ever met Achad Ha'am, or were there, cutting it up in Odessa with the early Zionist circles. But now here's a book about someone close in age to you, close enough, closer than a lot of these figures, and you're writing about a lot of the world that you came up in, especially, Roth writing during the 60s and 70s, and you coming up during the 60s and 70s, responding to the same political environments. And so I wanted to really begin by asking, how does it feel writing about someone closer to your experience, an American, closer to your age?
Yeah, everything you say is true. That's rarely said to you, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, yeah. When I've contemplated writing books, I've always tried to figure out if there was something new to say. And my first book was on the Jews of Odessa, and I was then teaching in England and spent a lot of time in Israel. And I decided to write a book on Russian Jewry during the First World War. At the time, I couldn't get into the Soviet Union, but there was a lot of German material because of the German conquest of so much of Eastern Europe during the war, and met with Jacob Katz, who was the great reigning Jewish historian of the time and someone I was close with. And I remember running the idea by him, and he looked at me and he said, well, once you know, what will you really know? In other words, don't you actually, is there much to say about this topic? And I dropped the topic. And then decided to write the biography of Achad Ha'am. With Roth, there was something sort of vaguely similar, although by then Jacob Katz had long died. But I thought of the idea, and Roth had been in my head ever since I was a teenager, for reasons that are transparent and less so, and I was beginning to think about writing about Roth, and then I discovered a tape of the event which he remembered as a notorious event at Yeshiva University in 1962. He remembered him having experienced excommunication. In fact, Solomon Rushdie, years later, compared his experience to that of Philip Roth at Yeshiva University. I discovered a tape of the event, and the audience loved him, and was laughing at his jokes. And the people who didn't like him, I'm not suggesting that we replicate this tonight, the people who didn't like him were those who came to the stage afterwards and told him how much they hated him. But that's, as I've come to see it, something of a Jewish ritual comparable to Passover Seder. And the chasm between what he had experienced and what he remembered persuaded me that there was a book to write. A book to write about someone who had spent almost his entire life writing about himself, but didn't. And that's really how this book began, and I describe that in the book itself. So the apparent chasm between writing a book about a pogrom and writing about Roth wasn't quite as drastic as one would assume. I thought there might be something to say, and started while Blake Bailey was writing his, and then continued after what happened to his book.
So I wanted to sort of speak about this moment you just brought up, where, and for people who don't know, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong about this, I'm sure I'm going to get some of these facts wrong, but there was an event at Yeshiva University, and essentially this was, this public Philip Roth is bad for the Jews moment, where he was accused of endangering Jewish community, Jewish world in general, for what he was writing. And it's curious to me that you said his memory didn't jibe with what was on the tape. I always had the sense that was precisely the thing that made his career. It wasn't that it was a false memory, it was that he promoted it as his excommunication.
I think sincerely, the event was not designed to embarrass him. In fact, the chair of the event, David Fleischer, who taught English literature at Yeshiva University, was a great admirer of Roth's. He did feel, and it was clear from the tape, that Roth ought to feel a greater sense of communal attachment. And the event, which featured Ralph Ellison, the great African-American writer Roth, and an Italian-American writer, was really built around Roth. But the fact that Roth actually ended up being convinced until the end of his life that he had been excoriated, when in fact he had been loved, is striking. And it did say something about Roth, about the place of rage in Roth's imagination. And it gave me a kind of an entree into writing about the man and the intersection between the man and his art.
So I wanted to actually pick up, sorry to jump there, but you said this idea of being found guilty of a lack of communal attachment, right? Which is something that I think pursued him for a long time until he became an eminence and so on. I think that one of the major gaps between myself and my own sensibilities and my generation, I think, and Roth and Roth's in general, is this idea of his complete insistence that I am an American writer. Not only that I'm central to the American canon, I'm an American writer. I remember that when I was young, a friend told me, if you want to see where Philip Roth lives, this is after 9/11, you go near the Natural History Museum and you look in that window and you see the window with the American flag that he put there after 9/11, and that's where he lives. And the idea of a writer putting an American flag in their window, a writer who had a false memory of being rejected by the Jews and was so insistent on being received as an American novelist, is something that is sort of unthinkable in a current situation. And I'm wondering what you think about this, what seems to me now an exotic species.
Let's leave the current situation aside for the moment.
Sure.
But for Roth, America and America's embrace of Jews, despite his acute preoccupation with anti-Semitism, a preoccupation that predates certainly his writing The Plot Against America, his notion that America was a place that was not really safe for Jews, but was the Jewish experience in America was as great as the rise of the State of Israel. This notion was one of his most emphatically strongly felt. And so consequently, one could write about Jews as people. And in other words, one could write about people with foibles, life within its complexity, the filthy side of life, and there was no risk to it. And so readers who were shocked at his treatment of Jews, a treatment now culturally a part and parcel of American culture. You look at shows about Italian Americans, African Americans, that actually don't hesitate to look at people's foibles, the dark side, and God knows there's a dark side to life. This was what Roth did with a sense of utter confidence that he was writing in a place and about a place that Jews were at home in. And so he came of age at the time of FDR, of Eleanor Roosevelt. He came of age at a time when Jews were comfortably part of the cabinet, though not on Wall Street. And he had no doubt that this was the America that Jews lived in. And so consequently, an attack on America was an attack on him. And so let's leave aside the distinction between those days and now, just
Sure.
for the moment.
So let's do the opposite. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, right? We have the 1950s, which has associated with it a host of iconographies and a host of histories. From a Jewish position, let's say from an American position, there is, in America victorious after the Second World War. From a Jewish position, it's the most important decade in Jewish history since probably the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. You have millions of Jews in Europe killed. You have the founding of the State of Israel. You have a complete shift in the balance of Jewish power. I mean, after Jewish powerlessness. And he is in this decade of, again, the most profound change of this people that he is associated with. And his introduction into fiction in the 50s is about trying to make it with a girl at a country club.
Right.
And I want to begin with that. You have a marvelous section about Goodbye Columbus, but maybe you want to kind of set up where you see sort of Goodbye Columbus as his launching pad and how that became a sort of, in my opinion at least, you tell me if I'm wrong, this sort of cornerstone and yet at the same time outlier to his work.
Yeah, he doesn't set out from the outset being a writer. He doesn't even know that he can write. He graduates high school, and his father urges him to study Spanish so that he might go into the banana business, because Jews, actually, the father of Leon Black, owns Chiquita Bananas. So he has no idea what he's going to do. He's studying pre-law at the Rutgers branch in New Jersey, and then ends up in Bucknell, a school that is pretty much, to the extent to which it's known for its engineering major and nothing else. And he goes there, and this is a particularly Rothian moment because he runs into a neighbor, a rather cloddish guy who tells him that he picked up and managed to start going out with a non-Jewish girl in Bucknell. And so Roth figures that place is right for him. He and then he discovers willy-nilly that he could write, and discovers people who actually make a living from writing at Bucknell. He discovers for the first time non-Jewish readers at Bucknell, and then he writes a series of stories that I describe in my book. And then in a conversation with Richard Stern, a good friend of his, who's a writer at University of Chicago, over lunch, he's telling the story about spending a summer at the home of his then girlfriend, Maxine Grofsky. And Stern urges him to write it down. And he writes it down, and he then enters into world literature with Goodbye Columbus. Let me just read you one page from the book about the inspiration for Goodbye Columbus. Let me see if I could hold the book and hold the microphone at the same time. That's the most athletic thing I've done all day. Okay. Roth was reading Huxley's Brave New World when Harold Itzkovitz first met him in the summer of 1953. Both were employed as counselors at YMHA camp, Forest Lodge, while their first conversation was about the book, Subsequent talks were mostly about other people at the camp, politics, popular musicals. A favorite pastime of Roth's was dirty word scramble, where the winner would come up with the filthiest. Itzkowitz recalls that Roth's antics over the summer would become legendary. Particularly memorable was Roth's announcement to the campers on Parents' Visiting Day that something terrible had happened. The director's wife, Marion, whom he despised, had lost her chastity belt. Roth now set in motion a camp-wide hunt, the hoax in full view of the visiting families. Roth now stood just over 6 feet. He was trimmed, lightly muscled. Photographs taken of him at the time show him playfully showing these off. His look then and later was rather more rugged than classically handsome than his brother Sandy, but sexual energy both exuded. Roth tended to fall in love quickly, sometimes just minutes after a first encounter. This is a lifelong trait. Unsurprisingly, he was very popular with the girls. Even Marion, according to Itzkowitz, was known to have been attracted to him. When Itzkowitz returned a decade or so later as the camp doctor, one of the first questions she asked was about his whereabouts. Roth spent his first camp summer courting a tall, pretty girl from Pittsburgh. He returned, this was the second summer, with whom he was having sex by the session's end. When he returned the next year, she took for granted that they would continue the romance. But Roth had found someone new. He had just been approached by Maxine Grofsky at the pool. With a thin, beautiful body and reddish hair, she was for Roth irresistible. She was 17, he was 21. His friend Betty Lehman, soon married to one of Roth's closest Weequahic buddies, remembers him watching Maxine as she walked on the beach, blurting out in amazement, she walks like a gazelle. Grofsky told me that she first spotted Roth and found him handsome, and she was about to embark with 2 other swimmers on a skit about the discovery of the biblical Moses floating in the water. And she walked over to him like Brenda Potemkin in Goodbye Columbus and asked him to hold her glasses. Roth captures this moment in the first beautifully crafted paragraph of Goodbye Columbus, quote, "I watched her move off. Her hand suddenly appeared behind her. She caught the bottom of her suit between thumb and index finger and flicked what flesh had been showing back to where it belonged. My blood jumped."
This early first foray, which was incredibly successful and embraced, inaugurated this odd period that we can say it's odd in retrospect of this American celebrity novelist. It was
not so odd at the moment.
Yeah.
Remember, Bellows Publishing, Malamud is publishing. The Diary of Anne Frank is on Broadway as of 1955. Jews at that moment, it's odd now in retrospect, and one of the reasons actually I think I wrote the book, was in order to remind readers of that moment, a moment where basically the Jewish experience seemed to represent the human experience.
right.
And Roth entered into literature at that very moment.
Right, but seemingly
I've never
at least-
interrupted you before.
No, you have. But it seems that that in a way, though, it was somewhat in contrast to the way that the Jewish Renaissance of culture was happening, because for him it was set in America. His protagonists tended to be around the same age as he was. His protagonists grew up with him, at least until middle age, right? Actually, no, throughout his career, they were pretty much coeval, and there was an insistence, as you put it earlier, that the Jewish experience in America was not a shameful subject. It was not a subsidiary or parochial subject. It could actually be the subject, and I'm wondering where that confidence came from.
It came in some measure from hubris. Philip is preoccupied with Anne Frank in some measure because Anne Frank is the person who represents Jews at that moment in the mid-1950s, early 60s. And from early on, he wants to be that person. And so to some extent, it comes out of ambition. a profound ambition that accompanies him throughout his life. And I don't think he doesn't set out to write about Jews. He sets out to write, and he writes about the world that he knows best. And the world that he knows best is this corner of Newark, where 95% of the people are Jewish. And so consequently, ipso facto, he writes about Jews. And insists, up until the time that pretty much Goodbye Columbus is printed, that he's not a Jewish writer. And would continue to say that, but one definition of an American Jewish writer is someone who insists that they're not an American Jewish writer. And in as much as Jewish, even at the time when Malamud Bellow, all these other writers rose to the fore, suggested something parochial, in contrast to, say, Eudora Welty, who could acknowledge that she was a Spanish writer. Chekhov was a South Russian writer, but somehow Jewish suggested something parochial. And so the insistence that you're not an American Jewish writer was simply, it was a tick. It's not to be taken seriously.
There is an element of his work which I begin tracing at Portnoy's, where though there are hints of it before, but really with Portnoy's, it's the explosion of it, that I think has been sort of under-recognized until really this book, which I found certain parts of your discussion of this phenomenon I'm about to mention being very compelling, which is most people with Portnoy's, focus on the fluids or the acts, right? And there's certainly enough fluid and there's enough act. But what's interesting is that all of that, the polymorphous perverse, coexists with a broad sentimentality about the old men. Will I ever be a man like my father was? The old men and their balls slapping the seats at the Schwitz, right? And I wanted to ask about that coexistence in his work between the seemingly transgressive or the expressly provocative, right? And this strain of nostalgia or sentimentality that is rooted in some sense of belatedness or loss.
Yeah, at its core, Portnoy is not about what the book seems to be about. Portnoy, Roth points out at one point, he said, in order to be bad, we couldn't skip school, we couldn't steal cars. The only way you could be bad was through sex. And but it's a book that is filled with yearning for mediocrity, not to excel, not to get good grades, not to be a good Jewish boy, but to be able to do what other people do. People who, without any misgivings, hunt deer or drink whiskey, and the prospect of actually just being a schlepper is in many ways what the book is about. It's also at its core about being alone, something that's impossible as he describes it in a Jewish home. There's a cousinship, as I've come to see it. I ran this by Roth, and he wouldn't acknowledge that I was right one way or the other, but I'm convinced I am right about this. He was a very close reader of the Soviet Jewish writer Isaac Babel. And in one of Babel's finest stories, The Awakening, actually written during some of the bleakest moments of Soviet life, the story of The Awakening, some of you may be familiar with it. It's about a Jewish boy in Odessa. His father decides, because there have been so many Jewish violinists of great distinction who have been reared in Odessa, that his son is to take violin lessons, will become a great violinist. He has no talent. He hangs out at the sea, and about 5 weeks later, he looks out the window. Mr. Zagorski, his violin teacher, is coming to the house. And so he locks himself in the only place that you could actually have privacy in a Jewish home, the toilet, the home of Alexander Portnoy. And he locks himself in the toilet, and he waits until nighttime. His family try to break down the door, but the lock holds. His aunt comes to fetch him from the toilet that night. They're walking through the streets of Odessa, and this is the moment that I think is crucial to Babel and the reason why he writes the story, and crucial to Roth. Babel describes how they're walking through the streets. He's holding on to his aunt's hand, and then he says, I thought about running away. But he never does. And Roth never does. And so much of Roth's work is about thinking of running away. And you never do. You don't run away from that family. In fact, family is embedded in so much of his work. And you can't run away because you'll lose something essential of yourself. And so Portnoy, which seemed to readers, even the editorial board of the New York Times, that ran an editorial lambasting it as an exemplary as an example of promiscuousness in the late 60s, Alexander Portnoy gains no enjoyment from his freedom. He's a neurotic. And it was that, reading that, or actually a chapter of it, Whacking Off, to explain what that's about, a chapter published in Partisan Review, which I read at the age of 17, just about to leave for Yeshiva, for rabbinical school in Chicago, that embedded Roth in my mind. And because what I recognized there is someone yearning to leave Orthodoxy, wanting to stay, feeling that there was a world out there that was actually immeasurably more interesting intellectually and certainly sexually than the world that I was living in. What Roth actually brought home to me already at 17 was that the larger world is no panacea. Portnoy has all the freedom of the world, and yet he doesn't enjoy it. And that lesson that stayed with me. His voice stayed with me, and to some extent, it was that voice that I ended up revisiting when I started on this adventure.
Yeah, it's how can I die? Everything I hate is here, right? The theater.
Right.
I think that the one of the interesting things is sort of in retrospect is the arcs of his career, and I'm leaving a lot of things out and kind of being very broad about this, but there were some deep wilderness years. And what I was particularly interested in, and these are purely for personal and my own perverse interests, were how he essentially became an experimental writer. He was someone who had, in some way you would think, perfected this form of a monologue. Or at least that was something that brought him enormous fame and acclaim. And the New York Times opinion notwithstanding. And yet he feels all of these currents of what happened to the novel in the 60s and the 70s. And he has, on one hand, the sort of American postmodern tutelary muses, right, and his own response to Anglo-American modernism. And on the other hand, he has this coming in through translation, an encounter with the writers of Eastern Europe. And that brings to him a sort of an untrammeled modernism that isn't involved with the American scene. And I wanted to ask where you see his development into My Life as a Man and the period after that as a novelist, and what were those wilderness years like for him?
Yeah, it's a pretty packed question, Josh. He hates being criticized, loathes being criticized, and then he ends up taking risk after risk with books that almost are certain to be criticized. And this is his deep understanding of ambivalence is born out of something in his soul, and so he writes that baseball novel that no one is, except for a great devotee of baseball, I think has ever read, and he writes The Breast.
Far shorter.
Right, and then he's savaged in December 1972 by the critic that he admires the most, Irving Howe, a great literary critic whose sensibility is in many ways quite similar to Philip's, and is criticized for what Howe calls a thinness of culture. And Howe is very sensitive. I mean, Roth never learns a foreign language. His intellectual scaffolding is thinner than that of others that he's traveling with now, and one of the insights of my book, and I may or may not be right about this, is that though he is intrigued with Kafka before, it's now in the wake of Howe's criticism that he actually becomes the great expert of Franz Kafka. And because who can actually claim that the greatest living expert of Franz Kafka in the English language has thinness of culture? And so he's constantly in conversation with critics, with Howe at this particular juncture furiously, but with critics like Case and Robert Alter and others throughout much of his life. There was another part of your question that I can't remember because I wanted to.
Yeah, I
wanted to highlight my discovery about Kafka.
Yeah. No, I mean, it seems to me that it was through this, and this is something that I think, as a Jewish novelist in America, you end up sort of setting a template for that becomes a template for many other sort of hyphenate American yearnings, which is when you want to somewhat absent yourself from the influence of the American scene, or to in some way deflect from it because that becomes, I don't know, overbearing or too present. There's the embrace of the foreign. And so I really wanted to ask, being torn between, as his series would put it, the writers of the other Europe and the American postmodern tradition, I was wondering what you thought was his relationship with both, especially the European one seems a little bit clearer to me than where he saw himself fitting into a world of Pynchon, a world of Coover, a world of John Barth, and so on.
Yeah, he didn't. I don't think he ever saw himself as fitting into that particular world. He, from the very beginning, he's very much a writer's writer, and with books integrated into his writing, but writing that he seeks to render accessible, unlike Pynchon. And it's enormously important. In fact, he worries inordinately at the beginning about being seen as a middlebrow writer, and because his prose is as accessible as it is. So he integrates, already in Goodbye Columbus, David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, even though there's no reference. He integrates, later on in Portnoy's Complaint, Freud and Nietzsche, even though, well, there's plenty of Freud. There's no Nietzsche, of course, there's Freud. But Freud then is pretty much commonplace.
Well, yeah, the whole section about Leonardo, the memory of Leonardo's childhood with the feathers in the mouth.
Right.
As the fellatio dream.
Right. Well, he's not going to give up on a fellatio dream.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't see himself as a kindred spirit to Pynchon, but he doesn't want to be seen as a kindred spirit to Irving Shaw either. And so he negotiates that distance between them in prose that is filled with a preoccupation with books, but never bookish. And that, I think, is a feature of his from the very beginning. Kafka enamors him for all kinds of self-evident reasons. In many ways, all of his work is about that small man who can't get into the castle. And but at the same time, his ambitions are massive. In other words, Philip's ambitions are those of Max Brod. His sensibility, as he sees it, is that of Kafka.
So I wanted to come to, from the position of a biographer, someone who began playing with what he was already doing naturally, which is, again, writing protagonists around his own age, protagonists that he knew would be gleefully or obsessively compared to him personally.
Right.
Inventing doubles, Zuckerman, Kepish, and so on. When you look at his autobiographical impulse and the way in which he is constantly frustrating it and manipulating the reader into making identifications that are then in some way avoided or undermined, how do you feel as a biographer looking at him as an autobiographer?
Yeah, of course he is an autobiographer, and he's not. He eventually tires of fiction and admits this to people close to him. He is convinced from the earliest stage of the value of that insight of the one-time sociologist guru Paul Goodman, of the superiority of life over writing. He wants to be able to write something that's as close to life as possible, and is convinced that fiction can't manage that, and it actually even calls.
Where would you date that to?
Around the time of the counterlife. And so he actually describes the counterlife and several of his subsequent books, not only the facts, his autobiography, as nonfiction, and initially insists that his publishers call a book like Operation Shylock a nonfiction work. And when I first spent some time with him in the early 90s, he talked to me about his work for Mossad. And when he was interviewed by reporters after the publication of Operation Shylock, he actually insisted that the book was true. And what he was doing was, I think, playing with the notion of truth and trying to insist that the fiction that he was trying to write would be as close to life as possible, hence that scene in The Ghostwriter where Zuckerman, who's come to the home of a now obscure but great short story writer, and he's sleeping in his living room, as I recall, and upstairs is the bedroom of this woman who he's momentarily convinced is indeed Anne Frank, who's romancing the older writer, and Zuckerman begins to muse about how this is what fiction does not capture moments like this. It's moments like this that ought to be at the epicenter of all writing. And that, in many ways, is what he tries to do. And so his writing seems autobiographical because that's what he knows best. He wants to write about what he knows best. And so what he knows best is this one corner of Newark. He knows his body, and he's able to use the two as a kind of fulcrum to write about the world. And as often as not, manages that, it seems to me, successfully.
And so, I mean, not to bring everything full circle, but I'll try for a moment, is, this biography is something that, I don't want to say you knew, right? I mean, you obviously did an enormous amount of research. But when it comes down to this idea of writing what you know and what you experience, because it can provide the closest, it has the greatest chance of coming alive in a reader's mind, right? Do you feel that was the case for your work on this? Like when you were writing about his response, for example, Our Gang or something like that, does it bring to mind when you were marching against Vietnam?
I just shared this with you, but
Yeah.
You weren't supposed to share it with the audience.
Sure. What, that you were against the Vietnam War? I'm sorry.
I was one of those rare college students against the Vietnam War. Yeah. It seemed important, as I alluded to before, to remind readers, especially at a juncture like this, although I started the book 5-6 years ago or more, at a juncture vastly different from this, of a moment where writing about Jews would be seen as synonymous with writing about the world, and a moment where the Jewish experience could be seen as a prism for contemporary life, and so in that respect, it was a book project closer to home than anything else I'd written before. I think, but mostly Roth was just always in my head. The combination, his insistence that one lived through words, that the way in which one brought clarity to life was through words. The notion that you couldn't live fully without spending those 8 hours at one's writing desk, which is kind of bizarre.
Because it seems anti-life to be sitting.
Well, it
for so
seemed
long.
to be pretty much a description of my own life.
Right.
And yes, and so and there is something peculiar about this. I've come to be convinced that for so many of the artists, the writers that I admire most, they end up circling around one particular wound. And you end up exploring that wound time and time again. And the difference between an artist and a neurotic is what you do with it. And I think that statement itself is slightly autobiographical, or more than slightly autobiographical. And so yes, it as someone who came to be convinced that the only way to bring clarity onto the world was with the use of words as clear and transparent as possible, Roth ended up staying with me. And I think, though I wrestled in anticipation of this session as to whether I was going to say this or not, but I think as horrified as I am by the current occupant in the White House, what horrifies me the most, which isn't the worst of sins, is his use of language. And I think it was Roth's insistence on sophisticated language that was clear, The notion that you actually brought clarity to the world with the use of language is what kept me reading him throughout my life. And that probably is more than anything else what brought me to write the book.
So I'm getting a flash of fingers. So I think we are opening the floor to questions.
Did I say anything that provoked a question or two?
Yeah.
I'm curious about your friendship with Philip Roth. When did you meet him, and what was your friendship?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was a friendship. It was, I knew him. I describe in the book how we first met. I had become director of Jewish studies at Stanford. I taught for a long time in England. I came back to the States. I wanted to distinguish our program from other Jewish studies centers, and inviting Philip Roth to speak seemed one way of doing it. And I thought I was a brilliant negotiator. It turned out he was on a book tour for Patrimony, so there was nothing brilliant about what I did. I worked hard to try to persuade him to meet with the Jewish studies faculty and graduate students. He resisted. Eventually, he said he had nothing to say to people who did Jewish studies. I suggested that he simply put a pin into one of his books and read that section. There was a famous pin test that was popular among devotees of the Talmud. And in any event, I don't think he did that. But what he did do in quintessential Rothian fashion is when I met him on campus, ready to bring him to the lunch with Jewish studies faculty and graduate students, he was standing beside a woman who looked unlike any I'd ever seen at the Stanford campus. Her blouse was open, visible were her bosoms, and he brought her to lunch as a way of antagonizing everyone at the lunch. And it was brilliant instant theater, and I described that in my subsequent conversation with Roth. Later on, I don't know quite what he saw in me. His view of academics was not an exemplary one, and I think he liked the fact that I knew Jewish history, and he liked the fact that I liked his writing, and being the rule breaker himself, he offered to share with me all the material that he'd shared with Blake Bailey when he was writing his authorized biography. Of course, he'd signed an exclusive arrangement, and Blake refused, and then Blake's book ended up where it ended up, and I had access to all that material, and then more, much more, and then wrote the book. And so we were friendly. I don't think I would claim it as a friendship in the way that he had very close friendships with others.
So I'm looking at the cover of your book as well.
And did you have any complaint about it?
And Stung By Life, it seems to, in a sense, capture what you just summarized. This need to write in order to, in a sense, capture life or communicate. But I wanted to ask you about that process when he's sitting there, because his writing often seems so fluid. It almost seems easy, like he's just sitting there and it's, and it floats. But really, what was his process like? How did he struggle to get the words that seem so easy once you're reading?
Just one comment about the cover. So I chose that particular photo advisedly because it seemed to really sort of capture what it is that a biographer does. You're not in the same room with your figure. You're looking in from the outside, and you're watching him behind glass, and it's as close as you can come. I'm acutely aware, having grown up in a family like all of us have, that you have a family event and you walk out of a room and then almost everyone in the room has a different account of what happened. And as an historian, I write never being in the rooms that I write about. And so what I use for my work are the papers that end up falling onto the ground and ended up being put into files that are called archives. And I'm expected to actually recreate those rooms. And so I've always approached what I do with this book too with a certain sense of modesty, that you can't be absolutely certain. Roth struggled with his writing. He'd often produce no more than one page. You know, I remember his telling me that he lived down the street from the most beautiful park in the world, but he couldn't permit himself to actually enter into it until he finished those 1 or 2 pages. And even then he would hesitate. I mean, I don't allow myself to go outside, as my wife, who's sitting here, knows, until I finish 4 or 5 pages. It's crazy. It's a crazy way to live. And but that's what you do when you write, and you take writing seriously. And so he tortured over his writing. Writing of Goodbye Columbus came with extraordinary fluency, but that was the exception that proved the rule. But tell me if I've answered the question that you asked. Yeah.
As a Roth biographer, what is
You're the first. This is the first time I've actually been called that. So this is my first launch. But okay, I'll accept that. Yeah.
what is your reaction to the reception of the Blake Bailey book and its aftermath?
Imperfect people write books, and it's a book filled with immense amount of useful information. And so having said that, and the reception by and large before his past was discovered was by and large positive. In my mind, perhaps slightly too positive. At the very beginning of my book, I offer an example, a quick example, of the difference between my book and his. And what I suggest is this: there's a letter that Philip writes to his then close friend Alan Lulchik, a now rather obscure novelist, and he writes this in the late '60s, and Blake cites a paragraph from the letter accurately, and it's in among his Philip's papers at the Library of Congress, a letter that both of us saw, and what he writes is I'm quoting Roth. Here now. Don't stick your dick into Alice Denham. Now, Alice Denham is the only woman in the history of Playboy who published a short story in the same issue that there was a pictorial of her. Don't do this because the head of the Guggenheim Foundation is hot for her and you won't win a fellowship. Okay. So he cites that paragraph accurately. But the rest of the letter, written in '68 probably, is devoted to the inner workings of what's going to be a good The Ghostwriter, published more than a decade later. And he's also previewing the writing of American Pastoral that won't be published for another 30 years. But what Blake saw was that paragraph. And what I see is the rest of the letter. And Philip Roth's loves were books, above all his books, but many other books. The other people in his life, female and male, were tertiary. And so when you decide to write a biography of someone, you write about, and if the person merits a biographical treatment, you write about what is most important to that person. What Blake wrote about, by and large, was not what's most important to Philip. But what he wrote contains a great deal of enormously useful information. And that's what I could say to your question. If you want to press me, but thank you for not pressing me.
Given that much of this content, most young readers only get exposure to Philip Roth in the form of short stories, specifically Defender of the Faith. And then, of course, as the only Jewish kid in your class in high school, you're put in this very awkward position. Just curious if you had thoughts on how he was perceived by younger readers, or if he gave any outsized importance to what generation he was affecting.
Yeah, I think today he's not received by younger readers. You're maybe the youngest person in the room, and I think that's a terrible shame. I think in contrast to many of the readers he came of age with, I mean, an example, by the way, of the way in which Jews dominate literature at the time. John Updike creates the whole Beck series with a Jewish protagonist, and if there's a Gentile of his generation, John Updike was that. I think in the wake of changes in the primacy of what literature is, the rise of female voices in the wake of George Floyd, and then perhaps capped off by the controversy surrounding the Blake Bailey book, where Blake's behavior was conflated with Philip's as vastly different as their behavior was. Philip has by and large disappeared. And I think with the exception of writers and filmmakers, and I devote the last chapter of my book to the way in which he continues to actually animate a whole array of literary voices. He's become a writer's writer, and partly because of the degree to which he ends up investing himself in his literature, so that it seems to me, on reading him today, he actually does not feel dated in the way that an extraordinary stylist like John Updike or even John Cheever do feel dated. And so I would think it's useful to try to prod younger readers, if you know people younger than yourself, perhaps do that, to actually revisit him. And there's a way in which he insists that one not shy away from the most horrible aspects of life. And even as he's experiencing these aspects, temporary impotence, old age, older than old age, he writes about it in books that sometimes are great, sometimes are just okay. But he insists that you actually look at the underbelly of life. You look at the underbelly of the making of leather. You look at the underbelly of all the industries that may end up producing beautiful things, but just if you look at them carefully and look at the way in which they happen, there's horrible things that happen as a result. He never shies away from those things, and I think that's one aspect of his that continues to remain pertinent, perhaps today more pertinent than ever before.
What do you think his wound was?
What do I think is?
Wound.
Yeah. He's someone from the very outset who is consumed by what his good friend, who wrote a superb book about him, Benjamin Taylor, described as his inner anarchy. And at the same time, he's raised to be utterly fastidious. Now, I'm not now going to blame it on the mother. I'm not, just to highlight this. On the other hand, what I discovered in researching this book is that his brother Sandy and Philip didn't use the bathrooms of their friends in the friends' houses because none was as clean as theirs. And one of Philip's longstanding lovers, Barbara Sproul, described to me about how his mother visited them in Connecticut and had never seen, apparently, a dishwasher, and was rather dubious about the efficacy of a dishwasher. And then Barbara woke up in the middle of the night and heard some tumult in the kitchen and walked downstairs, and Bess, his mother, was cleaning all the dishes that had been cleaned in the dishwasher. And so the interplay between fastidiousness and those many aspects of life that are the antithesis of fastidiousness probably points to the wound that I'm alluding to. And yes, and so I that's what I suggest in the book without pointing fingers at any particular person. Portnoy himself continues to say, what were their real sins? They really didn't sin all that badly. Why can't I get over it? You know, that there's that marvelous section. Do you remember the marvelous section in Portnoy's complaints where he talks about their meshuggah, their crazy behavior because they avoid pork everywhere except the Chinese restaurant. Because the Chinese restaurant is one place where you could eat pork because somehow it's encased in God knows what. But let me just read you that one section. Hold on. I didn't mark it, but it's one moment. Here it is. Yeah. I will either find it or I won't. I didn't find it, but it's in the book. You got to buy it.
Yeah. Do we have? Oh, right here.
My copy of Portnoy's has an afterword in it that is an essay I think he wrote in 1994 called Juice or Gravy, where
Right.
he makes the claim that he found a piece of paper that has every first sentence of every book that he read.
He's a fiction writer.
No, I know, but I was just wondering if you could kind of like contextualize where he was, I guess, in his career as a writer, making that kind of joke claim and what the point of it was in your head.
Yeah, I admit I just wasn't overwhelmed by that
Yeah.
essay, and of course the only thing I think that's accurate about it is that I think he's eating in a rather slimy Hungarian restaurant, and that those are the restaurants that he enjoyed eating in, and but I think it's initially written for a German edition of Portnoy, and then it's. But I would have to refresh my memory. Write to me and ask me that question, okay? Okay.
You know the.
There's 1 minute.
Oh, we have one more. Okay. Yeah.
What parts of the book, or just the parts about Philip Roth, were you most relieved by that you could write about Philip after he died, versus writing something that he might have?
Yeah, he. In his fiction, he pushes his characters in ways that he frequently would not push himself, and so he his portrait of the evil witch to whom he was married to, his first marriage. I spoke to all kinds of people who talked about how impressive she was. I found things that she wrote, a book proposal that she actually sent to Houghton Mifflin, and he was involved with a woman named Barbara Jacobson, a very famous art collector. Involved. They were sexually involved for decades, and she described to me how she gravitated toward having affairs with artists and writers, not only because of their common interests, but also because they could free up their afternoons. And she always wanted to be home for dinner with her husband. And she died recently, and there was a reason why I started with Barbara Jacobson. Oh yes, right. So Barbara, along with other friends of his, fantasized for years about how he might murder his first wife, who was claiming alimony, large amounts of alimony at a time when Philip wasn't making much money. What shocked her in particular was the day that Philip learned that she had died, and she bought a bottle of champagne and wanted to celebrate with him. And he was shocked. She described his face actually as rabbinical. You can imagine what she thought of rabbis. And I'd learned from someone I interviewed that that he felt massive guilt about her death, and that they had, according to this one woman who talked to me, a huge argument the day that she had her fatal accident. So I don't know how he would have responded to that section of the book, but I mean, unlike Blake, often took Philip at his word, and it's not that I was convinced that he was lying. I'm not convinced that he wasn't sincerely describing that 1962 event at Yeshiva University, but I rubbed what he said against other evidence, and at times I found what he said wanting, and I think the most strenuous act of research that I engaged in was a trip to Stockholm. Now, despite his demurrals, he was absolutely convinced that he was going to win the Nobel Prize, and
our president.
And a different Nobel Prize than Trump, as I understand it. But someone had actually suggested that the next prize that Trump might claim is the Academy Award for his appearance in that movie, Home
Alone 2.
Home Alone 2. But a number of his former lovers were willing to speak with me, and hadn't spoken to other people who worked on Philip. And his most long-standing lover is this woman, Milletta Pfeiffer, who's Drenka, who's portrayed as Drenka in Sabbath Theater. And I was talking with her on Zoom. She was taking material out of a box in her living room in Stockholm. And I got off the Zoom and I walked upstairs to talk to my wife, and she said, well, if she has material in that box, why don't you go to Stockholm? And I bought a ticket to Stockholm and spent 4 days in Stockholm. Philip felt that she had betrayed him. She was interviewed by Claire Bloom for her book, and I devote a chapter to Milletta. I'm not sure that he would have enjoyed the chapter. So, yeah. Yeah, but what I remained even more enamored with his writing at finishing the book than I did when I first started the book. I never tired of reading him, and never tired of being preoccupied with what it was that by far most preoccupied him, and that I could say as well.
So you made it to Stockholm, Steve. Roth never did. It seems like biographers are always one-upping. There's something that's not actually like.
So this is Jesse Tisch, who's one of the finest interpreters of Roth that there is. And Jesse, what did I do wrong?
My mother's here.
Is she here?
No.
No, okay.
Roth writes about this oppressive Jewish guilt that he supposedly feels, which is not uncommon for Jewish boys of that generation.
Do you want to share anything?
Autobiographical influence.
Okay.
Did he successfully overthrow that, or did he live with that burden and struggle with it throughout his life?
Do you know anyone who's overthrown that? I mean, you can name names if you wish. Of course not. But he turned it into fictional gold. Yeah. The guilt. Yes, of course. The guilt is that he's not like his father, but he wouldn't want to be like his father, but he would want to be like his father. The reason why I'm convinced the main character who returns to time and time again is Zuckerman, is because Zuckerman is riven with ambivalence, and in contrast to his character Kepesh, who is simply monomaniacal, and so yes, he's riven by ambivalence. He's in many ways at the epicenter of his work, as I see it, is family, and yet he has no relationship with his brother's children. He has barely any relationship with his first cousins. I have a closer relationship with some of his first cousins than Philip did in his adulthood, and lovely people. And yet at the very epicenter of book after book is family up until the very end, Nemesis. What I'm convinced of is that a greater plague in Nemesis than the plague is the fact that Bucky Cantor does not have a father at home. And that's the source of his anguish. That's the source of his greatest anguish. And so, yes, riven by ambivalence he is. And if you've met Jewish boys who've gotten over that, just send me a list. It's gonna be rather short.
You had a question?
Yes. Why don't you just say two things?
Daphne, hello.
Hi. One is not a question. One is just.
When I was thinking of you, when I mentioned that he would fall in love within moments, and I believe he proposed to you, didn't he?
Yes.
Okay. And within moments.
Truly.
Right.
I would argue that he suffered from too little guilt.
Too little.
Like Roth did not suffer from too much guilt in his dealings with people, especially with women. But certainly I didn't think he was a man humbled by guilt. But the question I wanted to ask you, which always intrigued me about him, was for someone who was certainly ethnically Jewish and taken up with the question of Jewishness, he always struck me as absolutely incurious or uncurious, whichever, about Jewishness, right? Anything to do with the history of Jewishness, a knowledge of Jewishness, or did you find that not to be the case?
Yeah, I did not, but
Yeah.
Jewishness is such a massively packed term.
True.
So incurious about the religious nature of Jewishness, yes.
Yes. I get
Yes. I figured you did.
that. Yeah.
But about so many other aspects of Jewishness, certainly not. He explored those constantly throughout his life. And about guilt, guilt about his incapacity to be a better son, guilt about his antagonistic attitude toward his brother Sandy when Sandy ceased to be an artist and became an advertising person, guilt about people he cared about. Yes, that guilt, I think, weighed very heavily on him. And guilt about that he never actually acknowledged openly about his relationship with his first wife. Certainly. No guilt with regard to whatever loathing he felt for Clara Bloom. Certainly. But guilt, yes, I think was a major factor. Just not guilt about some of the categories that I think you're referencing.
Yeah.
I've never won an argument with you.
We might draw final question here. Final question, then we'll draw to a
I
close.
just wondered if you knew the history of that photograph. It was taken at
Yaddo.
in the West Room when he was working on the breast in a room that actually had a couple of that looked like a breast.
Right. No, I know more than I write about.
On that note, maybe we should call it to a close. But a huge thank you to Stephen and to Joshua.